Have you ever thought about how something as small as the dimples on a golf ball could actually be related to keeping a hypercar worth millions of dollars stuck to the road at crazy speeds?
Well, the connection's actually a lot more direct than you might think.
That's pretty wild.
Welcome to Einstein Motors, where we do all the hard work breaking down the results and science behind everything automotive.
And today, you've brought us a deep dive into a really cool piece of engineering.
That's right.
The Goosebumps on the Bugatti Bolide.
Yes.
We've got some really interesting stuff to look at today about those and the whole idea of vortex generators in general.
We do.
So let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
Our mission today is to try to figure out how these little features that seem so simple can actually be so important
Right.
for managing airflow and really boosting downforce in high-performance cars like the Bolide.
Exactly.
So before we get too deep into the Bolide itself, can we talk a little bit about vortex generators or VGs?
Of course we can.
What are they exactly?
Well, you can think of them kind of like small fins, almost like tiny wings that you might see on an airplane or even some cars.
Okay.
Their main job is to create these little swirling patterns in the air. Tiny tornadoes, if you will.
Wow.
Called vortices.
Okay, so tiny tornadoes.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty dramatic, but what do these little swirls actually do?
Well, they energize something called the boundary layer,
Right.
which is basically a thin layer of air that sits right next to the surface and moves really slowly. These vortices that we're talking about mix that slow-moving air with faster air from further away,
Right.
which gives it a bit of a boost.
So it kind of kicks it into gear a little bit.
Exactly. This extra energy that we're talking about helps the airflow stick to the surface better because it can resist this thing called flow separation,
Okay.
which is basically when the air starts to peel away from the surface.
So why is preventing that so important?
Well, if the air separates, a wing can lose lift and a car can lose downforce. But if you can keep the air attached, then all those aerodynamic surfaces keep working the way they should,
I see.
especially when you're going really fast or at really sharp angles.
So that's why you often see VGs on the leading edges of wings and control surfaces on airplanes.
That's exactly right.
They're usually pretty small, right?
Yeah, they are. They're usually about the same height as that boundary layer.
Okay, so the angle of these VGs is really important for creating those vortices.
Yeah,
And then those vortices kind of re-energize the flow.
that's exactly how it works.
Interesting.
The angle creates something called a tip vortex, which pulls that faster moving air downwards.
Oh, cool.
And it's really interesting because the turbulent boundary layer that these vortices create is actually better at staying attached than a smooth boundary layer.
Really?
Yeah, because of all that extra mixing we were talking about.
Ah,
This makes things like flaps and rudders on airplanes much more effective.
okay.
But there are also other devices that do similar things like vortilons and leading edge extensions.
Okay, so that's a really good overview of vortex generators.
Yes.
I think that's a good foundation.
Right.
Now let's move on to the Bugatti Bolide and those very unusual goosebumps.
Yes.
I'm guessing these aren't like the standard fixed vanes we were just talking about.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
They're actually a really creative way of using the same basic principle.
Okay.
So you've got these dimples on the Bolide's roof.
Right.
They're located just behind the engine air scoop.
Hmm.
And they look kind of like goosebumps.
Right.
You might think they look a bit like the surface of a golf ball.
Yeah, I can kind of see that.
And golf balls use dimples to make the boundary layer turbulent, which actually helps reduce drag.
Okay.
Or maybe you think they look a bit like a shark skin.
Yeah, maybe.
But the main thing they do is act as vortex generators.
Really? So they're like active vortex generators.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the coolest thing about them is that they can actually change shape.
Right. They can move up and down, can't they?
That's right. Okay. These goosebumps are electronically adjustable. Wow. They can either stick out into the airflow or they can stay flat against the roof.
I see.
So when they're inflated, they create turbulence in that boundary layer.
Just like the fixed VGs.
Exactly.
Okay.
So by creating that controlled turbulence, they pull that faster air downwards,
Right.
which energizes the flow right over the roof of the car. And this helps the airflow stay attached to the surface as it moves towards the rear wing.
So that attached flow is really important for the Bolide's insane downforce
It's absolutely essential.
because it keeps the car stable at high speed.
Exactly. If the air flows smoothly over the roof and stays attached to the surface, then the rear wing can work much more effectively,
Right.
generating lots of consistent downforce. That's what keeps the Bolide glued to the road even when it's cornering at super high speeds.
Wow.
This ability to adjust the goosebumps is kind of like the DRS system in Formula One.
Okay.
It gives the driver another way to control the aerodynamics of the car.
So whether it's a fixed vane on an airplane wing or an electronically controlled goosebump on a hypercar.
It's all about manipulating that boundary layer to keep the airflow attached.
Right.
And make sure you're getting the absolute best aerodynamic performance.
It's amazing how such a small design feature can make such a big difference in how a car performs.
It really is.
The Bugatti Bolide's Goosebumps are just such a cool example of how engineers are using those basic aerodynamic principles in really creative ways.
Yeah, they are.
Especially with that added layer of dynamic control.
It makes you wonder what they'll come up with next.
Definitely food for thought.
Right.
So what does this mean for our listeners out there? It really shows how even tiny details in a car's design can have a huge impact on its performance.
Right.
If you're interested in learning more about the technical side of things, we've got tons of deep dives and our awesome automotive calculators over at einsteinmotors.com.au.
We do.
And don't forget to follow us on social media to stay up to date on all things Einstein Motors.
Definitely do that.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
See you next time.